Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It is great to be with you. This morning, we are going to be looking and thinking about governing resilience and climate repair. It's one of the big topics that we need to explore. We hear about resilience within the scope of the Paris Agreement, but actually, what do we mean by governing resilience in light of the Paris Agreement? So we want to explore, what is the role or the benefits and drawbacks of decentralized approaches to climate resilient governance and repair, and thinking about all of the people in the world. How important is the role of indigenous knowledge in this process? Now, unfortunately, we've had a recent rise of right-wing ideologies, particularly in Europe, and these have been associated with protectionist and nationalistic policies. This has increased fears of rollbacks of policies which have been introduced to increased resilience. So how can it be? Is it possible for climate resilience and repair to be implemented with a long-term view that is not changing every cycle, every election cycle? So we're going to be joined today by some fantastic speakers. We have Lily O'Neill from the Melbourne Climate Futures in the University of Melbourne. We have Luke Kemp, who I believe is actually up in Durham today, but he's a research associate for the Centre for Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge. Alex Bradley, another postdoctoral research associate, but with the British Antarctic Survey. And Jose Di Bella, a postdoctoral fellow at the Waterloo Climate Institute. We're going to hear from each of these for a few minutes, and then we'll enter a discussion. So Lily, if you could kick us off, that would be great, please.
Okay, thank you so much for having me here today. And I'd just like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which I sit, which I'm currently in Naarm in Melbourne, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay respects to their past and present and acknowledge that the land here was never ceded, though we are currently undergoing a treaty process here in the state of Victoria. I'll start that way. So I guess, Shaun, your first question is about governing resilience in light of the Paris Agreement. And just very briefly, I'll say that I'm not an Indigenous person myself, but my role at Melbourne Climate Futures is to provide research support for the fabulous First Nations organisations we have here in Australia who are doing the important work in relation to clean energy carbon repair. And in Australia, we have a very large continent. We've been climate laggards, but we're blessed by geography. And what people are waking up to at the moment is, despite being laggards on climate, we're probably going to benefit very much from this energy transition because our land is fabulous for generating wind and solar. And what people are also waking up to is that it is Australian First Nations people who own, they have rights and interests in about 40% of the continent, which is a huge area of land. 40% of the Australian continent has First Nations rights and interests in it. And this land is the best land for generation of large-scale renewable energy and for climate repair, the best land. So that's to just paint a bit of a picture, and most Australians don't yet understand this picture at all, that it will be Australian First Nations people and their land that lead our response to the energy transition. So what does governing resilience mean in this light? And I'll take you back from the continent-wide picture and come down to a very local point, which is, I was hearing just this morning, in fact, I was in Canberra on Ngunnawal country, and I was hearing from a woman who's called Dr. Valerie Coombs. She's the head of a very important centre at the Australian National University, and she's a Quandamooka woman. And she was talking about fire on Stradbroke Island, which is the traditional land of her people. And what the research is showing increasingly is that Indigenous ways of fire management, what's called fire stick farming, is an incredibly important way to battle climate change. It is a way of preventing those sorts of wildfires that we in Australia see far too often. Me and my family had to, we were almost burnt during the 2019-2020 fires. Indigenous fire management is an essential way of preventing those fires, but also of ensuring that much less carbon is released. So an Indigenous fire management system sees cool early season burning that ensures we don't have those sort of large out of control wildfires. Back to Valerie Coombs' and the Quandamooka people on Stradbroke Island. She told a story yesterday about fires on Stradbroke Island and how the firefighters, the Queensland firefighters, were sent in and were telling all the local people what to do on days 1, 2, and 3 of the fire. And by day 4, she said all these Queensland firefighters were in fact now turning to the Aboriginal men on Stradbroke Island, and it's the men who are traditionally the ones to firefight, and saying, okay, we can see we've been getting this wrong, please tell us what to do. But the way that our system operates, of course, is that these men were not consulted first. Queensland has jurisdiction over firefighting these areas, and they're not consulted. The flip side of that is that some of these men on Stradbroke Island have been doing those sorts of early cool season burns, their way of caring for country. And country is a term known by First Nations people as being, it's not just the land, it's the relationship with the land. You care for country, it cares for you. It's a way of thinking, a set of, it's religious, it's juridical, it's philosophical. And these men were caring for country by doing cool early season burns, and they were arrested. They were arrested because they don't have the legal right to do this. And they're currently, so I'll put that aside. They probably do have the legal right to do that under native title law, but most people in Australia don't understand that. And so some local council person arrested them and gave them the fine, and they're currently fighting their way through the magistrate's court. Look, when it gets up to a higher court, no doubt they will win. But in the meantime, they're fighting sort of petty bureaucracy that is trying to, lay one sort of set of petty Australian bureaucracy over what is a set of laws that have been shown to be fabulous for climate repair and that date back to deep time. We're talking 65,000 years of knowledge here about how to live sustainably. So I'll wrap this up by saying that we need to be listening to Indigenous people and ensuring that governance doesn't get in their way and indeed supports these efforts. That's what I'd say about law and governance. I hope I've answered your question. Lily,
thank you so much indeed. And could I encourage everybody, we're going to do questions after we've heard from the panelists, and therefore, Lily, you've really certainly got my juices going in my brain, in terms of lots of good questions. But I would encourage everybody to pop their questions into the system. It's into the Q&A, I believe. But whatever the system is, please make sure that you provide the questions so that we can actually feed off the extra knowledge and insights from our panel. We're now going to be joined by Luke. So Luke, if you would take us through your thought piece on this, that would be great. Thank you ever so much indeed.
Thank you, Shaun. I think it's worthwhile taking a step back and actually asking the question of what is resilience? Because it does have quite a fuzzy, ambiguous definition. It is defined differently in lots of different fields and areas, but the general definition that's used in socio-ecological resilience is the ability for a system to undergo shocks and perturbations while retaining its basic functions and identity. That's problematic insofar as what system we're talking about, what are its basic identities and functions, and what kind of particular shocks we're talking about. I think when we talk about shocks and perturbations, it's quite clear. We're talking about the impacts of climate change. But the system, in light of the Paris Agreement, can mean a lot of different things. It can mean nation states, and it can go all the way down to local communities and Indigenous peoples. And I think another thing that's worth considering here is that we don't want all things to be resilient. Cancer is very resilient. Autocracies historically have been quite resilient as well. We want to make sure that we're promoting the resilience of aspects of society that we find beneficial and are worthwhile preserving in the long term, and not necessarily everything else. So I think that's more a set of questions and kind of provocations than is like a clear answer. But I would like to briefly echo what Lily said. There's very strong evidence here that when you look at local communities and Indigenous-based adaptation efforts, they tend to be the best as far as we can see in terms of actually mitigating, getting co-benefits from and being resilient to climate impacts. So it does seem like in general, climate resilience is something that's best done at a local level rather than being done at the kind of highest levels possible. Although of course you're likely to require interventions at multiple scales.
Luke, thank you ever so much indeed. So we're now going to follow you, Luke, with Alex. So Alex, would be very grateful if you could share your initial thoughts on the questions that have been posed.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just also wanted to start by saying thank you so much for having me here. I feel a little bit out of my depth not being a policy or governance person, but hopefully I can add a climate science perspective to this conversation. And also I think it's really important that these conversations have a wide variety of stakeholders, and in particular, I think climate scientists as a community really need to engage with the policy discussions more. So yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I think I have two thoughts about resilience in light of the Paris Agreement. So just kind of focusing on the headline from the Paris Agreement, which was to limit global warming to well below 2, preferably below 1.5 degrees C compared to pre-industrial levels. And I wanted to say something about pathways. So when the IPCC presents its reports, it solicits pathways towards what they think, what people project the future will look like. And something like 3,000 of these pathways were submitted in the last IPCC report. And there are very, very few of these plausible future scenarios which keep to below 1.5 degrees C of warming. And there are even fewer still which don't kind of have this overshoot where you go slightly above 1.5 degrees and then come back down with some sort of carbon removal. And I think that speaks to the fact that we need to have very, very rapid change. We need to have policies implemented which enact quite significant change in pretty much every aspect of society. And that's going to require a lot of resilience, I think. There's going to be lots of changes in people's lives. There's going to be lots of people who are going to have to change the way that they live. And that's going to require resilience from communities and governments to enact those policies and stick to them. And I think that also speaks to the importance of events like the COP conferences where these international policies can be adopted. The second thing I wanted to say was resilience in terms of mitigation. So 1.5 degrees of warming is still going to have significant impacts in terms of weather events, in terms of climate change. We've seen even this year at 1.2 degrees of warming, the significant flooding in Pakistan, the flooding in Nigeria, the heat wave in Europe, for example. And once we get up to 1.5 degrees, those effects are only going to be worse. It's not like there's a magic threshold at 1.5 degrees where we don't have any impact if we're below and we have terrible impacts if we're above. You know, it's kind of a sliding scale of impacts. So even if we stick to this 1.5 degrees, we need to be prepared to have significant adaptation as well as the mitigation of CO2 emissions. And my own research is on sea level rise. The IPCC predicts that even if we keep to this 1.5 degrees C pathway, by the end of the century, we'll still have almost 0.5 meter of sea level rise. And that's going to affect a huge number of people, on the order of tens of millions of people who live in coastal communities. So we need both adaptation as well as mitigation. And that speaks to an urgent need for resilience to the impacts of climate change. So yeah, just to kind of summarize, I think we need resilience in terms of the policies that we put in place, and also resilience in terms of mitigation and adaptation.
Great. Well, thank you ever so much indeed, Alex. Can I just reiterate, we've had 3 speakers now, and there are lots of ideas, lots of challenges being floated by our wonderful panelists. And I would encourage everybody, therefore, to put some questions into the Q&A, which we can then feed to them and actually have your questions at least debated, maybe not even answered, but certainly debated and thrashed about by our panelists. So our 4th panelist this morning is Jose Di Bella. And so Jose, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I guess that building on everyone's contribution, I think looking at the Paris Agreement, what it means or what it has laid out for everyone is a global pact to, in fact, address vulnerability and adaptive capacity, which these are components and part of the efforts where we need to see resilience building efforts at multiple scales, from the national to the local. And I think we are yet unprepared, both in policy frameworks, but also in expertise, in metrics, and in engagement to actually put in place all the mechanisms that will allow us to build that type of resilience at both the national level systems and also things that trickle down. So part of governing the decision-making process, I think it will involve following the path that Paris in itself lays out of participation, wide expansion from multiple stakeholders, but also thinking about the failures and the possible sporadic or increasing collapses of certain places where resilience will not be sufficient. And I think governing and making decisions about those failures is going to be also part of what we can start to think about in certain ways. And it's not about being pessimistic, but as Alex was mentioning, the trajectories of what we're seeing and some of the overshoots that were likely to happen need to be part of the discussion of how this governance process are taking place. And I think illuminating on all the gaps that we see that are disconnecting national efforts from local solutions, as Lily was mentioning, and all these forms of knowledge need to be integrated. So I think looking at Paris, what it tells us is, first of all, a national will and a concerted effort to find solutions, but also of the complexity of not only doing an energy transition, but looking at all these social and environmental and human factors that are playing into the process of trying to build resilience at multiple scales. And I think we're still at a mismatch of how this happens. And I think going back to Paris is really the spirit of what it represents, which is this coming together of multiple levels of government, trying to find and commit to actually building these processes through the next decade or so. So I think, in my mind, Paris should give us a guiding light of how to deal with the positive and the efforts to build, but also with the preparedness and thinking about how to deal with governing these failures in the coming years. So thank you.
Jose, thank you ever so much indeed. So what I'd like to do now is to move to a Q&A aspect of the session. So again, if you've got questions in the audience online, please do submit them through the Q&A. We're going to kick off. We've got one from Delphine Saint-Martin. She says, hello, I've done my thesis on sea level rise and the protection of the right to live in the Pacific Island states at the University of Tartu in Estonia. Estonians have a great link to nature, as do the Pacific Island nations. Question is this: how do you see the cooperation between peoples to tackle climate change and protect human rights at the local, regional, or international level? So which one of you would like to take a stab at this to start with in terms of addressing that question? Lily, is this something for you to start with, perhaps? Okay, so Alex, sea level rise is your bag, so yeah, perhaps we'll go to you first then.
Thank you. I can jump in. Yeah, I think in terms of tackling climate change, I think just to focus on that aspect of the question is something that requires international cooperation. This isn't and this is exactly what we see at COP, right? Climate change is not a problem that respects borders. Emissions that occur in one country, predominantly in wealthier countries, have impacts around the world and actually preferentially have impacts in poorer nations. So I think this is a really international problem. And I can maybe give you an example of how we can have an international response to this. So we had an event here at Cambridge recently where we had someone from Client, the environmental charity, who came to speak to us. And he'd been working with the Torres Strait Islanders. So this is a group of islanders who took the Australian government to court. And Lily, maybe you can fact check me if I'm saying something incorrectly. They took the government to court because they said that the Australian government's policies were not compatible with the right to life of these islanders. And this was, they eventually won this case in the International Human Rights Court in The Hague, I think. And I think that's an example of how we can have, this is an environmental law charity that's based in the UK working with crucially with not just coming in and taking on a case. Their law is informed by the experiences of these people, and taking this to a third place, in this human rights court, and that kind of international cooperation that's required in order to combat this global challenge.
Thank you, Alex. Is there anybody else who would like to contribute, even feeding off what Alex has said? So I'm going to pose a question. So please do put your questions in the Q&A. So a question for you. We've talked about sort of climate change being a global problem, but the real value in indigenous communities who are spread far and wide across the globe and preserving and learning from their local knowledge. So that's about spatial separation. My question is about temporal separation of what we do now and for whom we are doing this. And this is a multi-generational challenge. So I would really actually value some thoughts regarding governance, and actually I'm thinking of the local level when we have this big separation, not just spatially but temporally. How does that work within the indigenous communities? Is this something that people think about not just for their own community, but do they think of temporal separation for other communities as well? Who would like to take a stab at that? Lily, yes, please.
I certainly don't want to hog the time at all, so please call me to a stop. And look, I'll just mention one example that I know quite well, and it's just a single example from the Kimberley in Northwest Australia, that way. So there's many different First Nations groups across Australia. But different regions can come to think of themselves as a regional block. And in the Kimberley, there's a system called the WUNAN, spelt differently depending on your translation, but WUNAN. And it's a Kimberley-wide, and it goes up into the Northern Territory, system, trade system and relationship system, whereby people followed literal paths through the regions and through their country and into other people's country to trade goods. But it wasn't just a goods trading system, it was also a relationship system and a system of care and a system of making sure you take care of your neighbours. And when you talk about the temporal issue, Shaun, Indigenous communities, I think, are so far ahead of us in thinking about those temporal issues, because the concept known as the dream time, that's been badly mistranslated into English as the dream time, is a system of belief that stretches back to deep time, but it doesn't only stretch back to deep time. It's known as being in what one anthropologist has called the everywhen. It's always here. So when people in the Kimberley are talking about this trade and bond system, their elders, past and present, who have died, are part of this. People in the future are part of this. Their children born are part of this, and their children yet to be born are part of this. So you're thinking about a culture and a system of caring for each other and caring for country that really encapsulates far better than any other philosophy I've come across that sense of us being a mere pinprick of a star in the sky, as the eminent Australian anthropologist Marcia Langton points it, that this conception of time and how we care for country and how we care for the planet is sort of akin to looking at the night sky. And when we look at the night sky, we see stars, but those stars are light that emanates from millions of years ago. And that sense of our brief temporal stint on the land has really practical impact in many Indigenous systems of governance. And for example, the WUNAN, and that includes that if one group today, so this is a system, tens and tens of thousands of years old that still operates really strongly today, and elders from across the region will get together and we'll debate these sorts of issues. We'll debate whether there's going to be a gas hub on the Kimberley coast. And they all came together and they said no at a certain point. We will not accept a gas hub, and you can't divide and conquer between our groups, because this system that brings us together says that if one person says no, we will stand with you. So there's those sorts of, and you know, I haven't even touched on the surface of this system, but it's a concept that brings together past, present and future in a very caring fashion where people really support each other.
Great. Luke, yes, but I was going to come to you, Luke, but you've raised your hand. So yes, please.
Yeah, so there are a plethora of different ways of thinking about intergenerational equity. As Lil's already mentioned, Indigenous peoples have been at the forefront of this for tens of thousands of years. There's also, for instance, the Iroquois Federation in Canada and North America, who famously, in their constitution, have it that you have to consider 7 generations down the line how your decisions will impact them. And this has been something that's also been discussed quite recently, even in the UNFCCC. So when I was doing my PhD, I was quite heavily involved with lobbying around intergenerational equity and this question of how do you better represent the rights of future generations in the negotiations. And there's a whole bunch of ideas, things like having a intergenerational arbiter or ombudsman. There was a big campaign for this, also within the UN General Assembly. At one stage, at RIA Plus 20, this was actually an item that was up for negotiation as well. The UN Secretary General in 2013 also had a report on intergenerational solidarity and justice. And there's a whole bunch of other ways you can do this, including giving future generations the right for litigation within legal systems, and even things like lowering the right of voting, for instance, and having better participation of youth in different kinds of democracy. The key problem of all this, of course, is just simple willpower. We have so many different interesting ideas of how to better integrate future generations and an intergenerational perspective into governance, but we're not doing it. And I think for fairly obvious reasons that it would probably make us take on more ambitious, progressive targets, and that would be going against vested interests. And as a brief aside on the previous question, and this kind of connection between human rights and cooperation, I want to briefly mention the work of James C. Scott on seeing like a state. So he's an anthropologist, and he has this very famous book essentially talking about how when very large hierarchies, such as states, tend to take on very large engineering projects, they often disregard the interests of those below them. And there's a whole bunch of examples like this, including the Three Gorges Dam, for instance, where it may have been good for reducing emissions, but it had pretty catastrophic impacts for local communities. And the only way to really break that link and to ensure human rights are respected while we decarbonize and have good resilience is, I think, to have much more bottom-up perspective, to basically work much more democratically, rather than relying upon states often responding in a fairly haphazard and top-down draconian fashion during an emergency.
Jose, did you want to contribute to this question, or are you okay?
Thank you. Yes, I think thinking about it in our generational lifespan, I think we have an immediate challenge to update many of the frameworks and put in place a lot of the institutions that will be necessary to actually continue doing the work that we need and we know that needs to be done in terms of both doing a just transition towards a low carbon economies and societies in general, but also all, as we have been discussing, doing it with equity and participation in a just manner, that where all the distributed benefits of investment and efforts that are being put, particularly now talking about resilience, actually grasp and protect things that will be coming down to the future, but also preserving those things that we value, and as they were saying, which ones we maintain to keep resilient systems moving forward. And one of those, of course, as we are touching today on Indigenous communities and knowledge, is primarily that. No, there's a pool of not only knowledge and wealth culturally, but also a set of values that will be fundamentally important for us to connect from where we see them coming from the past to all the governance arrangements we put in place to keep acting on climate change towards the future. And I think there's still an absence of mechanisms for including those different communities in the process. And evidence is even in the dialogue that we have today, where we're trying to grasp and look at indigenous communities and talk about them in ways that are separate from the actual process of discussing and having a dialogue about building these governance mechanisms. So I think temporally it's one aspect of assembling this system of action and knowledge. So sorry, I'll pass that along.
Great, Jose. Well, thank you. Well, I think that really feeds quite nicely into another question that we've had from Talia. She says, "Hi, I'm Talia. I'm a student at the University of Cambridge studying land economy. I know we touched briefly on the rise of populism and the problems with political short-termism, but I'm wondering what the panel thinks the best way to combat this, and that is in terms of implementing climate resilience. How do we combat this? What's the mechanism that you were referring to that just a moment ago, Jose? What mechanisms can we think about and introduce potentially to help combat this short-termism going forwards?" Who would like to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I'll follow up a little bit on that comment. Thank you for the question. And I actually, that goes back to that idea of wide spread engagement and reaching to all these different stakeholder communities, not only indigenous, but we're talking about the private sector. We're talking about urban communities, different types of associations and organizations that are not yet part of the climate discussions and decision-making processes for how we build resilience at the local level, and how we actually steer and shift investment vehicles, how we modernize from local regulatory frameworks to also the engagement of parliamentarians and parliaments in this process. And I think we need to see that happen in a meaningful way, not just token or dialogues or momentary consultations. We need ownership across all these different societal actors that actually build momentum, in my view, against what it seems to be a very tactical effort on right-wing or populist approaches of how they crystallize power, how science is being questioned, how the very essence of inclusion maybe and democratization of the process is at stake. And I think the role that activists, practitioners, scientists, and people working on climate need to do is bring all of these communities to participate in the process of governing at the local level, and that will make and resonate, I guess, and I hope, the political spheres that will help us. And most importantly, just to finalize, citizen involvement is fundamental. Sometimes it's in an unorganized or way, but having them understand, first of all, where they are at the community, but also the solutions, and be part of crafting those aspects of how we make decisions. I think that's going to be a fundamental effort for us to have a steer away from maybe some of these nationalistic views on what actually it's a planetary issue. So thank you.
Anyone else would like to chip in on this? Luke.
So if we're going to address right-wing populism, it's worthwhile knowing what the sources of it are. And there's a few different pieces which appear to have good evidence behind them. One is inequality, wealth inequality in particular. And I mean, it's pretty easy to address that. Things like closing down tax havens and addressing tax evasion. If you're going to do a carbon price, making sure it's double dividend, so the revenue is distributed amongst the populace. A second one is largely this feeling of disenfranchisement, that people are not being listened to, they're not being respected, they're not being integrated into their political systems. And I actually view this as somewhat of an opportunity. So when we say populism, it actually ends up being a bit of a useless term. It's a term that unites both a Trump voter and a Bernie Sanders voter. And the key thing that unites both of them is actually this shared narrative of regular citizens are not having enough voice in government, and currently governance is dictated and dominated by a few elite interests. And I think there's actually something to be said for that perspective. And a way of helping to diffuse the situation and to actually address their concerns is, of course, finding ways of making sure they are more involved in governance processes. And I think one very clear, easy way of doing that is through the use of citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries, what's called deliberative democracy. And there are also, unfortunately, despite these kind of like upvotes, so deliberative democracy and addressing wealth inequality, which are things we should be doing anyway, I think there are going to be difficulties where it's just going to be hard to address right-wing populism. And I think one of them is that whenever you have a previously dominant group losing its status, it tends to cause a certain degree of social turmoil. This is one of the key factors that often leads to civil wars, for instance. And what you see of right-wing populism is it's usually groups who have been ethnically or in terms of gender relations dominant within a society, and they're kind of losing their comparative status over time. And I think that's just going to require very sensitive and careful handling to make sure it doesn't spiral at all.
Gosh, okay, Luke, I know you're from the Centre for Existential Risk, and the term existential obviously can take different forms. That's quite humbling what you've just shared. Is there anyone else who would like to contribute to this? Lily.
Sorry, I'm putting my hand up like I'm in primary school, aren't I?
That's
look,
fine.
I'll just add two anecdotes, I guess I'll say. And there's sort of, and I'm aware that the Australians are dominating the conversation, and I apologise for that. But you know, we're kind of excited about our new government and that we're no longer laggards, maybe.
We are too.
I'll use what's called the taxi driver test, which is when you hop in a taxi in Australia and you talk to the taxi drivers. For many, many years, they haven't believed in climate change, and maybe they think immigrants are a bad idea, etc. But for years, they love their solar panels. Anyone you speak to in Australia, and obviously we've got some of the best land for solar photovoltaic panels, but we have the highest uptake of solar panels in the world. And people who don't believe in climate change love their solar panels because it reduces their electricity bill and it makes them more independent of major utilities. So there's something about, I mean, part of the resilience question is about, you know, talking about the wins. And certainly governments across Australia have done lots to subsidise solar panels, but even where they haven't, every taxi driver loves their solar panels. That's one thing I'd say. The second thing is a bit more of a depressing note, I think, which is that there's nothing like a disaster, a flood or a bushfire, to have people suddenly demanding action. And that's certainly, again, what we had in Australia after the 2019-2020 bushfires, which were, I'm sure you all know, you know, I mean, it was the pyrocene writ large. Places that had never burnt before were burning. My own little town came under risk, but more particularly, so people like me, I live rurally, but people in the cities, people in Sydney, were breathing in bushfire smoke that was akin to, you know, a couple of packs a day for 6-7 weeks afterwards, and that had only just cleared by the time we got COVID. And there's nothing like, going back to Luke's point about existential threats, there's nothing like an existential threat to concentrate the mind. And it's no surprise that we got a new government who was more committed to climate change afterwards. Now, this is a pretty depressing thing to say, that we need more disasters. And look, you know, the whole country's flooded at the moment too. I could barely drive down to Melbourne because of floods. It's a depressing thing to say that we need more disasters for people to demand that governments do something, but I believe that is part of it. But also the solar panels and the winds of the energy transition are also part of it. So it's some bit positive, bit negative kind of comment. Some good, some bad, as my children would say.
Great. Well, look, we've got a number of questions coming in, so I'm going to move to some other questions if that's okay. So the next one is from Maha. Maha is from the University of Waterloo, Canada. I have a question about tackling climate issues from an integrative approach, an approach that takes social aspects as well as ecological ones, because in less developed countries, people experience a synergistic effect of climate impacts with other stresses. Now, social aspects are just an example of many drivers that we can bring to the equation of climate resilience. So who would like to respond to that thought piece from Maha? So Alex, let's start with you.
Yeah, I can jump in, because I think this is a really interesting question from a climate science perspective, because we're now at the point where we're starting to see that social and kind of physical sciences aren't this clear divide that we've traditionally had. So there was a paper that was published, I think it was earlier this year, it could have been last year, basically presenting this first coupled climate system and society model. So, you know, you have your physical model of the kind of atmosphere, the oceans, the ice sheets, etc. But then you also have your model of what society, how people respond to these things. And this comes back to the point Lily was just making about when you have a significant event, then people's opinions change. And we're getting to the point where our projections are based not only on the physical science, but also on the social aspect to it. And in the same way as we have kind of tipping points in physical systems, so things like we talk here a lot about tipping points in the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional, that's a hard word to say at 9:30, overturning circulation, tipping points in the permafrost in the Arctic. We also have social tipping points. So when there becomes a significant proportion of the people who adopt certain views and adopt certain practices, then it becomes sort of almost a social taboo not to have those practices, and we get these very, very rapid changes in society. So I think, yeah, I think my answer to the question, if I have answered it, is that we can't necessarily think about these two things in isolation. They're intimately coupled, and we need to have an approach that really is a synthesis of the two.
Great. Is there anyone else who would like to contribute to that? Okay, Luke, over to you.
I can jump in very briefly. Once again, aware as well that the Australian should not dominate the conversation too much. Yeah, so I completely agree with everything that Alex has said. In a paper we recently published, Climate Endgame, we actually put forward this idea of integrated climate catastrophe assessments. And one of the key ideas there is, rather than just simply trying to tally up the individual hazards like sea level rise and heat waves, is actually trying to think through how societies respond and how could that potentially both mitigate but also aggravate the initial impacts, and have these potential impacts cascade throughout the system. And I think in terms of modeling, there's a whole bunch of different ways you can do that, ranging from expert elicitation, agent-based modeling. I think even looking at historical cases of how societies have previously responded to climatic stresses and changes could be quite illuminating. And ultimately, the reason we haven't done that, I don't think is because it's not worthwhile doing, it's just because it's harder, and it's hard to get funding to do so. And that is unfortunately something that's going to have to change going into the future, because this is a much more honest and realistic way of depicting both society, the climate system, and doing risk assessment.
Again, very sobering, Luke, indeed, understanding the impacts and how they might cascade. Right, we have a question from Nesma, who's on the screen as well. So look, a question for the speakers. Both governance scale and Indigenous knowledge have come up consistently amongst the speakers today. Are the barriers we are currently facing in integrating Indigenous knowledge for climate change mitigation an issue of governance scale or acceptance of Indigenous knowledge, or perhaps a bit of both? Who would like to tackle that?
I can make maybe a brief comment to that. I think it's both, but also it's a lack of understanding and fundamental understanding of that value system, and I think that's part of one of the challenges that we need to address. And I think researchers in science has begun to think about this in the methodologies and in the way some of our understanding of risk is happening, but also understanding of the practices, as Lily was mentioning, of different ways that solutions are emerging from Indigenous communities and things that have been done in the past. And forums such as this, or integrating into other knowledge building and mobilization processes, is where we start to see and understand a bit more about Indigenous communities. around acceptance, I think this maybe there's some historical barriers and societal barriers in different countries that actually have prevented this from happening. But I think there is an effort, at least I know in Canada, of reconciliation, that it's a long process, and Lily has alluded also to Australian one. But so I think every country will be on a different place, and that maybe speaks to this answer. And also to remind ourselves that it's not a monolithic indigenous community. It's a very varied relationship that exists among nations within a same state, if that's how we want to see it. Me being from Mexico, our own particular history, and having also family in different communities, there's a set of values still that need to be reconciled, I guess, and I think there's still work to be done on that. So I think it's governance for sure, in the way that we present and integrate individuals and communities to make decisions, and the acceptance aspect, as I said, I think it's historical value barriers, but also lacking of understanding still. Thank you.
Is there anybody else who'd like to contribute before we move to the next question? Okay, so we're going to then move on to our next question, which is from Iman Sabor. So Iman is a regenerative practitioner in Canada, and the question is, how can we build a learning capacity built on the indigenous knowledge and resilience best practices in our current modern lifestyle? So how do we do that? And my question would be, how do we do that, and to benefit not just those local communities, but to potentially benefit communities far away, which is, I think that's the potentially very, very significant. How can we do that? Alex.
Yeah, thank you. I realize I'm also copying you, Lily, and doing the hand raising thing. Yeah, I think I could maybe say something about the role of Indigenous knowledge and the law. So this came about from a conversation I was having with a friend who's a lecturer here in Cambridge, and she was telling me about research that she had done in, I think it was in Sweden. I'm going to have to fact check myself afterwards, but and she was essentially saying that much of the kind of evidence that Indigenous communities in this part of the world have is kind of passed down through stories, through conversations, through imagery, in essentially in media which we can't necessarily use as in the kind of evidence. It is evidence in a kind of cultural sense, but it's not evidence in the eyes of the law. And this is a really big opportunity for people to work together with Indigenous communities. So my friend had done some research, basically taking this Indigenous evidence and performing a kind of quantitative study based on this evidence to kind of give cold hard numbers to these stories, which could then be used in litigation, in courtrooms, for example. And I think that these laws that are then enacted as a result of this scientific evidence doesn't just affect the Indigenous population. So it sets precedents which can be enacted on both national and international levels. But the evidence that it underpins those cases is essentially provided by Indigenous communities. And there's a kind of chain of events that we have to do to bring that standard of evidence, and I'm putting that very much in quote marks because that's a legal standard of evidence rather than and I'm being quite cautious not to dismiss the importance of Indigenous stories in that.
Well, actually, so can I just bounce, Alex? You talk about evidence, but actually, isn't there great value in some of the, you say stories, but Indigenous knowledge, which might not be reflected in actually hard scientific evidence because it hasn't been necessarily looked at in earnest, but just Indigenous knowledge of how to go. And Lily, you mentioned about some of the practices earlier on in terms of caring for the land, and it's about the values and relationships of your local, let's say of your local asset, your land, that perhaps aren't reflected in other ways of modern life.
Look, yeah, absolutely, Shaun. I hope that was a throw to me to be able to talk, but look, absolutely. And I think that the more that sort of Western research spotlight is put on Indigenous practices, the more we will, the more we have come to see. There's been a great deal of research already about how sustainable these practices are and how useful they are. I will just say, Alex, that certainly in Australia, in the rules of evidence in court, that a lot of those Indigenous stories and different practices and art and dancing are accepted as evidence, and I think in Canada as well. But I digress. I'll just say one thing about how I think as a lawyer that question can be answered, and that's by implementing free, prior and informed consent. So Indigenous people hold huge amounts of property rights and interests around the world, and if the full extent of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in relation to free, prior and informed consent, which means that the consent part being the best, the key part of it, if Indigenous people are afforded the right to consent or not consent to projects on their land, I think that is the best and quickest way we can ensure that Indigenous knowledge is embedded in their land and throughout broader society. Why? Because if they can consent to a project in negotiating with a developer or in developing a wind farm themselves, a solar farm themselves, they can ensure that an Indigenous best practice is practiced on their land, and their land is significant. So implement free, prior and informed consent, and Canada is in the process of doing it.
Is there anyone else that would like to contribute at the moment? Go with Jose first.
I was just going to add one note is I think some of these, when we talk about evidence and knowledge, it is simply, I guess, and it's a reflection, it's codified differently. And the way that we understand and the methodologies we normally might have used in research and the way we engage and approach Indigenous knowledge around climate will be distinct. And I think the illustration of storytelling and other forms of participation might not be immediately evident to the way we, in more traditional research methodologies, maybe codify that process and that knowledge, or how is recognized in a legal or governing framework. But I think that's part of probably one of the first efforts, now establish this shared language into some of the things that we're wanting to integrate into how we make decisions around climate change. And I think that's part of the efforts of figuring out and better understanding how these pieces to fit together for those that are participating in the process now. So.
Alex, I think you were next if you wanted to.
Yeah, I just wanted to bounce off something Lily said there, and about giving Indigenous communities the right to decide which projects take place on their land. And I think it's incredibly important that governments and communities respect those decisions, particularly when they potentially fly in the face of what people would traditionally think of as environmentalism. So I have one particular example in mind, which is from the Fairy Creek in Canada. So this was a big ancient, it still is a big ancient woodland, which is on Indigenous land. And Indigenous people, in conjunction with the government, decided that this would be logged, would be felled, and this was potentially giving great benefits to the Indigenous people in terms of economy, in terms of jobs. And the Indigenous leaders supported this decision, but then there was a massive influx of, I guess, Westerners who opposed the decision to log this region of forest. And so then we kind of have this clash between Indigenous rights that aren't necessarily, and their policies that aren't necessarily kind of the traditional Western ideas of environmentalism. And just to say that we have to, if we pass over that right, we have to respect the decisions that are taken with that land.
And Luke.
Yeah, it's the annoying thing about democracy is even if you disagree with what people say, you kind of have to still accept the decision. Just very briefly, I think one thing to bear in mind is that some fields have been better at integrating Indigenous knowledge. So I think, for instance, the Intergovernmental Panel on Ecosystem Services and Biodiversity, IPBES, has been, I think, substantially better than the IPCC has traditionally been in terms of incorporating Indigenous knowledge into its processes. And that while we often have this idea that there's only certain forms of evidence, usually kind of very clear, quantifiable evidence that can be used in science, already as it stands, we often tend to incorporate all sorts of weird and wonderful different considerations as evidence. You know, in mathematics, aesthetics is actually considered as like an important part of whether or not an equation checks out, is like how simple and elegant it is, for instance. Political science, we use anecdotes all the time, and you know, individual cherry-picked case studies, etc. Philosophy is often built upon thought experiments. And there's not a huge difference between, for me at least, the evidential quality of things like that versus an oral history. Indeed, an oral history actually, I think, has a much stronger kind of anthropological basis as to why it should be believed.
Great. So I wanted to just ask a question to the panel myself, which is that we have been really fortunate at the Centre for Climate Repair here in Cambridge, been approached by a number of youths from the far north, so Operation Arctis, who are a group of young people in the Arctic community who are frankly just really desperate and concerned about the unfolding change of the climate and what we can do. And you know, that they are really sort of thinking what's going on elsewhere in the world is affecting them and their livelihoods, their local communities. And I think, Luke, you mentioned something about the voices of the youth, and it's the voices of the youth and Indigenous peoples. And yet I read on, well, this week, there are certain moves in one of the larger developed countries suggesting that the voting age of one party might be looking at trying to raise that to 21. Whereas in fact, should we not be doing the complete opposite and in trying to make sure that we reflect the voices of the younger peoples, because of this separation of timescales, whose benefit are all of these actions really going to affect? People of my age, you know, I'm north of 50, so you know, I'm not going to be the one that really is going to be personally benefiting from these big actions. It's the younger people and their children's children. So I would really just enjoy listening and hearing from you regarding your thoughts on how do we get not just the thoughts and views being heard, but actually making a difference in terms of the policies that are being made and the decisions being made, investments on how we're going to tackle climate change. Who'd like to take that?
I can jump in, maybe not with an answer, but with some thoughts. That yeah, I think that we heard, I don't know if you were in the previous session of the Climate Law and Governance Day, but there was a panel discussion about climate litigation, and we've really seen in the climate litigation community that many of these cases are being brought about by both young people and older people as well. Of course, older people generally have the right to vote, but these are typically, many court cases are being brought about by people who are below the voting age. So there was a really important case in Germany that was brought about by Lisa, and I hope I've got her surname right, Neumeier, I think is her surname. And, you know, we've seen Greta Thunberg bringing lawsuits. There was a case in Australia where there was the group of school children who were bringing about litigation in conjunction with an elderly nun. And so I think that speaks to the fact that these young people are looking for other ways to affect change and see the law and climate litigation as a really promising avenue. So maybe that's a message of hope that actually, even if we kind of have these democratic systems which are siphoning power away from young people, we still have this kind of other sphere of power, which is the law that young people are able to affect change through.
I agree with you, Alex. I guess one of the concerns I have in certain political systems is that who sits on the law itself is then subject. It's a longer time scale in terms of some of the changes, but how that gets changed is also therefore a function ultimately of the people that vote. It's a separation, I agree, but and I'm grateful for that, but it's not necessarily something that fills me with eternal hope regarding where that might end up. Any other thoughts? Luke.
It's worthwhile first noting that this is a very deep-seated and tricky issue. So even many Indigenous communities who are egalitarian in many cases often still have really clear decision-making hierarchies around youth versus elders. And I think it's particularly relevant today insofar as you're seeing very large differences between age demographics. Even in the most recent US election, the swing towards the Democrats was largely due to the younger voters, not the older ones. And there's interesting questions of what this means, particularly in the context of an aging population, where there's kind of a bulge population-wise towards older voters who are also not just have the right to vote, but also more likely to turn out to vote in the first place. How do you fix this? I mean, I think there's just reams of literature on this, and there's summary articles about, in general, ombudsman, youth representation, future generations in course, etc. The key thing is that we're not really experimenting or trying with most of these things. And I think it's exactly the same as with citizens' juries and assemblies, is that when we do use them, they tend to work, and that actually scares the people in power. And so hence they never actually get properly implemented. It's a fairly, I guess, crude observation, but I think it's generally true that the things that often work and are going to go against power don't usually get adopted. And I think when it comes to in trying to empower and include both youth and citizens in governance, whether that's in the judicial system or the democratic political system, that's just a clear case of that.
Right. Any other thoughts? So I've got one final question then, which is just thinking about for myself, is that we've got lots of things that are global action, and certain climate repair concepts, which might not just be a local endeavor, they might be a global endeavor, certainly cross boundaries. So for example, one of the projects that we're working on at the Centre for Climate Repair is, what might you grow in the ocean to try and just have more things growing, and whose boundary is this? So one of the projects involves the role of giant kelp and getting more of that, but actually there are communities, coastal communities around the world who've got a lot to teach us. But we've got this conflict between, well, whose right are these sorts of the open access to the sea? How does this work with different Indigenous communities and some of the other pressures on society where they might want open access lanes and things like this? What values or insights can be shared by Indigenous communities and pressures to help sort of build consensus that these sorts of questions at least should be being posed? Don't tell me I've asked a question that no one's prepared to at least chip in towards.
I think part of the hesitation is speaking of values that maybe might not be fully empowered to speak of. I would maybe answer that question not from an Indigenous perspective. I would answer that question going back to the Paris Agreement and thinking about kind of this global or the start of a global process in understanding that the solutions not necessarily will fall within national boundaries, and going back to the spirit of how we think about this at a scale that actually will provide the new set of practices that will be shared and mutually beneficial to nations beyond, as you were saying, the traditional borders that we can see or we have drafted. And more than maybe answering that specific question, I want to go back to the point of temporality. And I think we in the discussions that we have around climate, there's obviously a sense of crisis, but also urgency that we're having to deal with so many aspects, from the social justice components to all these dimensions of governance and the institutions we have in place to a very rapidly changing natural system. And at the stage that we're in, it is important to, in my mind, to be optimistic that the solutions that we're starting to put in place will be are only part of a process that has been happening for the last maybe 30 years since we recognized the problem at the scope that we're seeing it now. And these solutions that we're talking about, cross-boundary, even the integration of the natural and social worlds in the way that we're thinking about the climate science, the IPCC itself, it was just maybe two assessment reports past that we started to see more presence of social sciences reflected in the science. And I think going back to storytelling and all these other ways that we are thinking about knowledge and mobilizing a new sets of values among society are gonna take time. And what we're doing now is really that effort for us to think of these solutions differently. And that includes the indigenous aspect and knowledge and question that has been today, and I see as a center of our discussion. But I do think it's gonna be a longer process in some ways with very little time, but also being hopeful that we'll get there.
Okay, Jose, thank you. Now, we've got just a couple of minutes left. Nesma and Alina, were there any just final thoughts from your good selves that you might wish to share?
I'm sorry, I just wanted to apologize. I sort of joined a little late. So I don't know if this was discussed, but one of the things that, you know, from the point of view of like developing and developed countries would be an important consideration, as well as the gender aspect. I mean, as a woman, I can speak to, like, a lot of times we're put in that position, but we don't have the prior knowledge, and that would be something that knowledge building would be something that I'd you know, sort of consider an important element within this to actually reach like indigenous knowledge, but women also, even if they're not matriarchs, but they do have a lot of input that would be valuable.
Okay, thank you. And Nesma, did you wish to share any thoughts?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if I should unmute myself and speak. No, I think the discussion has been very lively, and I think the recurring theme that I caught up was that incorporating a lot of indigenous knowledge is vital, and perhaps doing that at a local level is the most effective. And it was very helpful listening to all the speakers. Thank you.
Great. Well, Nesma, thank you. So what I wanted to close by saying is that we did try, when we were organising this panel, to actually have more representation amongst the panelists of Indigenous peoples. So I'm Indigenous to the UK, but hardly, I don't think I'm actually the right person in a way to be contributing to this, but we failed in our efforts. But please know that we were very, very keen. And I hear you very loud and clear, Alina, that it's about actually real representation and diversity. So it's in all aspects that are completely important for when we're thinking about governance. We need to make sure that the views of all peoples are reflected in the whatever structures that are put in place to help us with our journey on climate repair. I would like to say thank you to the Waterloo Climate Institute. Professor Neil Clark is the leader of that in helping coordinate this morning and this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are. But I hope you have enjoyed this session. Very great thanks to all of our panelists and discussants and rapporteurs. Very, very grateful to you. And we wish you a very good day listening to the rest of this wonderful session. Thank you ever so much indeed. Bye-bye.